Loop 1. The man who would become master of this war closed the closet hiding his TARDIS with a soft click and looked around. Copernicus Station was a semi-permanent installation in a stable orbit. Located on the outer rim of the far galactic Union, it was a major border crossing and transit hub but had few full-time personnel. He could blend in easily here. The room he found himself in was a small hall, surrounded by windows looking out into deep space. Blocking the front was a set of small, battered booths guarding turnstiles, which cordoned off the desperate travellers crowding the room. Habitually straightening the cuffs of his false guard's uniform, the master stepped up to the closest unoccupied booth and sat down. Almost immediately, the crowd flooded over, clamouring on the other side of the countertop. Someone got to the front and shoved the sheath of forms towards him. He started flicking through. Health forms, immigration paperwork, various bureaucratic approvals, a series of discriminatory intelligence tests, family records. Then paused most of the way in.
You need form Zeta Gamma 305A if you want to bring property with you.
He droned.
This is form Zeta Gamma 305B.
There was only one stamp under the countertop. He spun the wheels to the right date and time, rolled it across the ink pad and stamped out a firm denied. It probably wasn't the wrong form, but that wasn't going to blow his cover. Everyone else in the uniform in the room was surely doing the same. He didn't have to have worked at this particular spaceport to know it was the same as everywhere. Strict instructions to deny people entry visas wherever possible. There were a few hundred people in this room, and that was always a few hundred more mouths than this spaceport wanted to feed. On the other side of the small hall, a commotion went up as someone tried to hop the metal turnstile next to one of the guard booths. A few people who'd managed to get one of the chairs around the room curled defensively closer around their stuff whilst everyone else looked away. The master looked down too, where apparently the crowd had replaced the person in front of him with someone else equally bedraggled and exhausted. He once again pretended to consider the forms for a moment.
Family members must be alphabetized by last name on each form.
Denied.
Pets and livestock are not welcome at Copernicus.
Denied. Despite all the rabble, border crossings were the best places to set up. For one, he became just another faceless authority, but with the kind of arbitrary power over people's lives that made them flinch from his gaze, lest they provoke him into arbitrary retribution. That kind of respect made the waiting easier, at least. The other advantage was the view. From where he was seated, floor-to-ceiling windows covered the other 3 walls, giving a clear view into space. From here, he could see everyone that was landing. It provided the best angle to try and foresee why the War Council had sent him here, before whatever it was foresaw him first.
Can't you see the refugees? Have you no mercy?
The master nearly dropped the stamp in shock. He'd know that self-certain righteousness anywhere, and, looking up, yes, those gorgeous curls and steely eyes. Was the Doctor who the War Council had sent him to solve this time? Hastily, he pulled himself together. The Doctor didn't know this face, and he mustn't give himself away so easily. He tried to adopt a distracted monotone, even though he felt more alive than he had in ages.
The war touches all our lives. You could say we're all refugees after a fashion.
Already, he was spinning out a backstory. He was Daniel Flo, Dab to his friends, retired mechanic. That line was from an argument last night between his idealist wife and his husband, who just wanted them all to keep their heads down. There was an eldest daughter lost to the war, and the shape of an interesting ethical dilemma for the Doctor already forming about the nature of employment. With them looking over his shoulder, the master was going to have to be at least twice as good.
That's nonsense and you know it.
The Doctor snapped.
Besides...
Officer Daniel Flo.
the Master offered.
Besides, Daniel, these are talented people, more than capable of pulling their own weight. And even if they weren't, they still have a right to life.
I don't know what you expect me to say. I'm merely an employee.
Persons started jostling Doctor, trying to move them out of the way. They ignored the queue entirely.
Yes, which gives you the opportunity to do something meaningful here.
The Master finally allowed himself to look up and make eye contact.
I'm on break in...
Quick calculation.
10 minutes. I'm sure I'd be happy to discuss this more with you then.
He took the next person's paperwork in a clear dismissal. The Doctor bobbed to the side, looking not at all dismissed. The Master was calculating whether he could get away with a good, unjust use of authority against them when there was a bright flash outside the far window. A moment later, the entire spaceport rattled under the impact, and people started screaming. The crowd began pouring over the Master's turnstile, but he ignored them. Both he and the Doctor were watching the window in dawning horror. Hundreds of warships flickered into view out there, all the same familiar circular disc shape.
Daleks,
the Master said quietly. Oh, playing games with the Doctor had left him vastly underprepared for this to be the War Council's aim. For a moment, the Doctor's eyes snapped to him. Then they grabbed his arm, pulling him practically head first over the counter. He scrambled to get his feet under him as the Doctor took off, weaving through the crowd, heading directly towards the docking sites. They slid the door open with a bang, and there was their TARDIS, in the same appallingly amateurish police box configuration. The Master glanced over his shoulder at the windows, gathered the last pieces of information that he could, and followed them in. The Doctor was starting a short flight configuration, and the Master started doing the same at another pilot station. The TARDIS console was still a TARDIS console, even with the Doctor's extensive modifications.
Don't aim for the flagship. The one at the back had an extensive communications array. Without that, they'll be cut off from each other.
He looked up and found the Doctor had stopped moving. Idiot! And was instead watching his hands.
Officer Daniel Flo.
He switched smoothly into Gallifreyan.
I'm afraid even I run out of anagrams eventually.
That look of realization was an aggravatingly gorgeous one, and damn them, he couldn't even take the time to enjoy it.
You died,
the Doctor said.
You let me die.
The resulting moment of blank, charged tension lasted long enough that he gave up and reached over to finish the rest of the Doctor's takeoff sequence himself. This was not an unsalvageable situation. The two of them against a few hundred Dalek ships. But they had to go, and go now. With the last flight levers set, the Master ran to the door to close it, but paused. Through the doorway, he could see out the windows of Copernicus Station. It was gorgeous. The lights and gunfire of war in hands of such skilled participants. He wanted to be out there. It was suddenly so clear that that was where he belonged. The Master could have watched this light show forever. Behind him, the Doctor's footsteps, no doubt coming to see what had held him up. Before the Master could think of how to express this horrible beauty to them, there was an awful, shattering crack as time herself gave way. It was an instantaneous disintegration of reality. The sky rent apart in spiralling fragments, a swirl of horrible colours that should not ever have been witnessed. It was as though his hearts were made of reddened glass, and their shards were tearing out of him, and he was overflowing out of the seams and cuts and holes in his fragile self that had always been there, but he had not been able to see. And the Doctor was an eldritch collage of everything they had been and everything they ever might be. Too many limbs and faces and alien creations spilling down their body, and everyone was silent, and everyone was screaming. And it had always been this way, and it always would be. And this was life, death, everything, nothing, always for everything, time. Loop 2. The man who would become the master of this war collapsed on the floor of his TARDIS and sobbed out a choking gasp, nearly vomiting. The next second passed. That was so unexpected that he didn't know how to react. He just lay there, and then another second passed, and another, and another, and another, and he could do nothing but lie there, letting time wash over him, feeling its rhythms again. He had never... A Time Lord should never have to live to see time come apart like he just had. This was what happened when the lower species were allowed to dabble with time, to try to harness that which only the temporal powers should rightfully command. People made mistakes, and what the Daleks had accidentally done with whatever new temporal weapon they'd created. He wrenched his thoughts away before the nausea could overwhelm him again. After a pause he could measure because time was again, he carefully plucked himself off the floor, straightened his clothes, wiped his face off, and put his compartment back together. And then, only then, he allowed himself to look around for the doctor. He hoped his breakdown hadn't been witnessed, or worst yet, happened alone. But he was the only one there. In fact, the Master realised he was back in his own TARDIS, instructions from the War Council still blinking on the screens. There was a new red light on the console that hadn't been lit before. With an appropriate degree of caution, he approached it to find it was labelled Anchor Lowered. He turned on his heel and, not permitting himself to hesitate, opened the TARDIS doors. A small hall full of a bustling crowd of hopeful and desperate refugees stared back. It was still Copernicus Station, still standing. No Daleks. In fact, by the clock on the wall, 1 minute before he'd run into the Doctor. The Master had arrived at the same moment that he had last time. The anchor had been lowered, his TARDIS had said, like with a boat, like ensuring a sudden rip current couldn't wash you away, pulling you back from the brink to where you should be, when you should be. The Time Lords must have added a fail-safe to his TARDIS. When? Without his permission? For that kind of catastrophe of time. It had pulled him and the rest of the universe back to their proper timeline, anchored to the moment his ship landed. It was the sort of war measure that nobody was expecting to have to use. Those seem to be getting used more and more often these days. Which meant the Daleks were still coming, which meant they were still going to make that same mistake with time as well, which also meant that the Doctor was still here. For at least one of those reasons, the Master stepped out of the TARDIS, closing the doors behind him with a soft click. This time, he wouldn't waste time playing a border guard. Clearly, this was a much shorter and more pressing assignment than his usual ones from the Council. He hopped the closest turnstile, forcing the crowd on the other side to give way or be trampled underfoot. They pushed back to make enough room for him to pass, with only a few dark glares he ignored. There, waistcoat, curls and self-righteousness, anachronistic in any time, he came to a breathless halt when they were only a few feet apart.
Doctor!
His guard's uniform got a wary look and a slow response.
Sorry, do we know each other?
The Doctor didn't remember the time loop. The Master hadn't been surprised that all the little people were still carrying about their days, unable to remember the timeline before this one. After all, they were hardly equipped with the senses for it, but for the Doctor to have forgotten as well? And, for that matter, Gallifrey had been uncharacteristically quiet in the face of the catastrophe that the Daleks had accidentally wrought in their pursuit of temporal dominance. A bit of a delay was to be expected, with how locked down Gallifrey was to the outside world these days. But this long was deeply unusual. Unless the Master was the only one who'd been anchored by his TARDIS. If the timeline was tied around him, then he would be the only one in the universe to remember it. A million ways to play this. Dramatically reveal his presence, revive Officer Daniel Dab Flo, apologise for the misunderstanding and leave the doctor alone, start an elaborate game rigged to allow the doctor to see through it immediately, or so many other possibilities. However, first and most important was to get them somewhere private. It wasn't worth causing a panic.
I have a warrant for your arrest,
the master ad-libbed. He pulled a random piece of paper out of one of his pockets. Devil's food cake, it cheerfully informed him, in the handwriting of a past life. 2 cups flour. He made a show of quickly comparing an imaginary image on the piece of paper to the doctor's appearance.
Now wait a minute!
The doctor objected, like Z didn't almost certainly have a warrant in this galaxy. It was a different time loop than the last one, so the master would use different pronouns for the doctor. It seemed like the sort of interpretation of the doctor's use of any pronouns that Z would have delighted if Z had known about it. The master put a firm hand on their back, shoved them into a brisk walk, ignoring their protests, mind whirring. Most of the primitive technology on this spaceport would be useless. There wasn't enough time to get a signal out to the High Council, and he had wasted most of their time in his TARDIS, trying to handle that temporal shock. No matter, what was done was done. The doctor was still chattering away, probably trying to charm him into a sudden repentance of evil, or at least enough of a distraction to slip away from him. The master instead opened the locked closet door and firmly shoved Zem inside, taking a certain pleasure in watching Zem stumble. The doctor looked up, looked at the TARDIS they were standing in, and then looked at the master with that same recognition horror understanding, and yet still no time for him to enjoy it.
You died,
the doctor said.
You let me,
the master shot back, for propriety's sake, but his hearts weren't nearly as in it this time. Behind him, through the doors that he purposefully left open, was that same blinding flash of light. The doctor froze.
Daleks, yes,
the master said without turning around. After all, the work he was doing on the console was critical. His TARDIS had weapons, unlike the doctor's toothless pacifist nonsense. If pressed, he might also have admitted that he was also enjoying showing off his greater understanding of the situation. He started keying in coordinates, but the silence behind him was dragging on too long. He turned around to see the doctor staring at him in dismal horror.
You wouldn't,
Z said.
Not even you would ally with the Daleks.
The master had had regenerations less surprising than this accusation.
You think me capable of that during wartime?
I have absolutely no idea what you're capable of,
the doctor said coldly.
And how else could you have known they were coming?
We are time travelers, you idiot!
The master snapped, but the doctor was still shaking their head warily. There was a slow, terrible feeling rising in the master's gut. He thought of his first time through this time loop. The doctor had figured out who he was, and then the master had assumed Z put aside their dislike of him in favour of focusing on the Daleks, like had happened so many times before. But the only thing the doctor had actually done was stare at him in shock. In fact, it seemed like the doctor currently considered him a greater threat than the Daleks. He didn't know when their relationship had been that deeply fractured, but he was beginning to suspect it was some point far beyond this one. The doctor bolted for the door, and the master scrambled after him. It was undignified, but he certainly couldn't afford to have the doctor actively working against him at a time like this. The doctor was fast, and they both flew out of the door and into an open war zone. Bodies were piled atop each other, holes punched through them in a perfectly circular burns, as an open attestation to their murderers. Some were still smoking at the edges. Others were screaming, praying, begging. Others were horribly silent. The floor was slick with blood. People were crammed against the turnstiles, shot dead mid-escape, while they trampled over each other in a desperate rush to escape the death trap that Copernicus Station's border crossing had become. There didn't seem to be a single living person left, apart from the two of them, and the platoon of Daleks in perfect formation in the centre of the room. The Master was loath to consider them people. A few things happened simultaneously. First, the Daleks all turned towards them as one. The Doctor raises her hands in surrender and opens her mouth, no doubt to attempt some of that famous diplomacy. Z surely knew it was unlikely. Z seemed scarcely able to look from the carnage around them, let alone string together a coherent sentence, far too trapped in the horror of the massacre they stood witness to. Z might have been crying. Second, in a clattering roar of metal and electronics, the Daleks all shouted and advanced. But third, and worst of all, the sky went crap. It was almost worse this time because the Master knew what to expect. He thought his knees might have given out if there was time left for them to do that in. Or maybe they had given out. They had always given out. He had always been here, kneeling, and oh, stars, the colours they were. He tried to squeeze his eyes shut, and he managed, and he didn't, and he never had eyes at all, and he had far too many eyes. Loop 3. The man who would become master of this war woke up in his TARDIS again, trapped in a barely stable agony of having been unmade and then forcefully dragged back together once more. He wondered briefly whether it wouldn't have been easier to just be killed by the Daleks rather than have to go through that again. However, he quickly discarded the idea. He wasn't sure whether or not the anchoring system would work without him if he was dead, and he certainly wasn't willing to risk a permanent death now. Not after he'd finally gotten his lives back. Not for something as trivial as a bit of pain. This time, he didn't bother waiting. He knew the parameters now. 3 minutes and 56 seconds between his arrival until the Daleks. 2 minutes and 11 seconds after their arrival. They made that happen to time. In total, 6 minutes and 7 seconds. If he was going to be in this for a while, he would make the best of every second. He slammed his TARDIS doors open and took off at a run. Fine. The Doctor thought he would side with the Daleks. He would just have to take a different approach. The Master needed something better than the truth. He needed to tell the Doctor a story. Loop 22.
Tell me the keyword.
What keyword?
The Doctor demanded. The plan had been simple. First, convince the Doctor that the Master was in a time loop. Then explain everything else before the Daleks ruined it. The two of them had had contingencies for this sort of thing. It should have been easy. Or at least, it had seemed like a good idea during the first dozen times that he'd tried it. By now, the Master felt he'd have better luck having this conversation with a human. Exasperated, he enunciated again.
When we were children, we each invented a secret keyword. The idea was that the only way I'd know your keyword is if we were stuck in a time loop and you'd told it to me before, but then forgotten it. So I need you to tell me your keyword now, so I can tell it to you next loop, and then you'll understand and we can stop having this stupid argument!
Absolutely not. You've got some scheme here that you're trying to trick me with. Well, I'm not buying it. You're not in a time loop, and I'm not giving you my special keyword.
The Master could have screamed in frustration, particularly because they'd already had this conversation in 10 separate loops before.
Can't you just trust me?
Why would I possibly do that?
The Doctor said, with an insulting gesture at the Master's, everything. This time, when the Daleks arrived to tear time apart like a plaything, and everything was undone, and always undone, and nothing and everything again, the Master was always grateful to at least be spared the Doctor's utter stubbornness. Loop 50. 50 times through this blasted, time-forsaken loop. Idly, the master wondered whether he would be trapped here forever in this endless horror of an ever-dying world. Or perhaps, worse yet, to never know for sure if he'd get it wrong the next time. To always have that thread of hope to cling on to. Unfortunately, unlike the doctor, he hadn't failed basic mathematics, so he could answer his own question. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and wrote the number 1. Imagine he wanted to try literally everything possible in his 6 minutes and 7 seconds of time loop. So here was a hypothesis he could try. If he wrote the right number on his piece of paper, maybe the Daleks would see it and somehow miraculously decide not to play with forces beyond their understanding. To test this idea, he could try writing every possible number he could and showing it to them. The number 1 during this loop, 2 in the next loop, and so on and so on. Now, theoretically, there were an infinite number of possible numbers that he could write on this piece of paper. In practice, there were limitations. No matter how small his handwriting, at some point he would run out of paper to write all the digits on. If he got more paper, no matter how fast he wrote, he would eventually run out of time, and so on. Still, he figured he could definitely get up to at least 1,000 digits. But the thing about numbers that big, at 6 minutes and 7 seconds per loop, it would take him as long as the universe had existed to get up to a mere 15 digits. And that was only with the black pen he'd pulled out of his pocket. Maybe the right number was 295,381,138, written in green ink. Or maybe it was one of the other uncountably many possibilities. The possibility space was staggeringly enormous. Even if it wasn't infinite, even he would go insane long before then. Perhaps the thing to do then was to collect as much data as possible. He could take actions as different and orthogonal as the ones he'd taken before, and see if anything seemed more promising than the current approach. Arbitrarily, he flipped the paper he'd been writing on over and discovered it was his devil's food cake recipe again. He sensed someone reading over his shoulder with a certain familiar curiosity. The doctor, extending that same blind trust towards the stranger that Faye thought him to be. Trust that he was apparently so undeserving of as himself. The master turned, sharp words on his tongue, around just in time to see the doctor pull an improbably large bag of flour out of Faye's pockets, accompanied by a giant white cloud.
2 cups of flour,
the doctor announced triumphantly from within the cloud. Unbidden, the master started to laugh, unable to cling to his earlier resentment. Sure, he can enjoy this one time loop, pretending to be a stranger. They could bake cake together. Why not? After all, he had nothing but time. Loop 51. Maybe he had just been telling the wrong story. The two of them hadn't been able to finish the cake in only 6 minutes and 7 seconds, of course, but eating batter together and talking had been... There were more kinds of stories than war stories. Maybe the doctor was tired of fighting too. It had always been what he'd liked most about the doctor, that ever-shifting, mercurial mix of optimism and insanity. Even at the heart of this war, it was still instantly recognisable for it. The only kind of person who would think to attempt diplomacy with a Dalek. The master tracked the doctor down again, but didn't bother trying to explain his identity. Instead, he spent the rest of the loop thinking about other kinds of stories, about optimism and forgiveness and kindness, and cruelty and rage and war and contradiction, about the doctor. Perhaps next time he should just be honest about everything, even the ugly contradictions inside of himself. Explain properly, truth without story. It was worth an attempt. It might get him that keyword. It wasn't like anyone would remember what he said. Loop 52.
Help! I'm stuck in a time loop and I can't get out!
The doctor had told him the keyword, and it was that nonsense? Anger was the easiest emotion right now. Anger at the doctor, anger about something which didn't matter, anger that this had worked. The Master had created his keyword by applying a cipher to the Fourier transform of speech formations of the High Gallifreyan word for time loop. But if his counterpart was going to set standards as low as those, perhaps he should stop trying quite so hard. Anger was easier than thinking about anything else he'd said or felt earlier this loop, even if none of it had been new to him at all. Time fractioned and consumed him again, and he gratefully let it. Loop 53.
Help, I'm stuck in a time loop and I can't get out.
The Master deadpanned. Finally, a look of not just comprehension, but trust crossed the doctor's face, and it had only cost him his dignity to get it. Still, the doctor was so gorgeous like this, there was a tiny whisper of hope that the Master could keep finding a way to make here looking over at him, like that, when all this was over. The Master wasted the rest of the loop, indulging a different, related set of unspeakable emotions. Loop 54. Eyes open, mind clear. New loop, and this one was about the Daleks. Together, finally. Even if it wasn't usually this hard.
Tell me everything you know,
the doctor said, a tactical map of the area around Copernicus Station open on the TARDIS console. In that moment, A looked every inch the strategic genius that had so easily dismantled so many armies. The Master quickly detailed the configuration of Dalek ships, the key communications array which held the fleet together, and experimental temporal weaponry which would so horribly backfire. As he spoke, the Doctor's hands flew across the TARDIS console like it was their own, setting coordinates and adjusting dials. Behind them, the Master inserted corrections. It was a utilitarian approach, but it'd do.
What should we expect once we've landed?
The Doctor said.
It's only my 4th time through the loop. You know everything I do.
The Master lied smoothly. The Doctor shot him a look, but then there was a familiar flash of light and a bang of the Daleks' arrival. They had bigger issues to deal with. The Doctor pulled down the flight lever. They rematerialised in space, flying a short distance behind the Dalek communication ship at the back of the fleet. By silent agreement, the Doctor was the one to open the TARDIS door and lean out into space. A sighted the Dalek ship and called out a set of coordinates. The Master aimed his TARDIS's weapon system at the given coordinates without bothering to verify their tactical significance. In times like these, he trusted the Doctor's instincts as his own. He fired, and death bloomed in his hands. Through the open door, he saw the front of the Dalek ship explode wide open. Fire rushed through the ship, consuming all the oxygen inside nearly instantaneously. Debris and Dalek corpses were thrown in every direction, most so torn apart as to be unrecognisable. The destruction was silent in the vacuum of space. Not that they would have had time to scream with those awful tiddy voices. This was the same feeling that the Master had been yearning for in that first loop so long ago. There was a time the Doctor would never have condoned this sort of wanton destruction. Instead, Ace simply called another set of coordinates, and the Master fired again. Time-Lord machinery bent to its highest purpose, control of the universe, crushing the upstarts who played with things they couldn't understand. The Master poured all of the pain and rage of those 54 time loops into destroying the ship. He was peripherally aware of the rest of the fleet turning to chase them, but it scarcely mattered compared to the knowledge that he would finally be done with this. Destruction of the communications ship was something that all the Daleks would have to pay attention to, which meant no experimental weapons used against Copernicus Station, which meant no more time loop. Which was why he was caught so entirely off guard when, after 6 minutes and 7 seconds, time went crap. Loop 55.
Well, you must have done something wrong.
The doctor insisted.
Look, maybe we should have targeted the flagship. I'm sure that's where the weapon is stored.
Loop 56.
Well, you must have done something wrong.
The doctor insisted.
Look, maybe we should try to destroy the entire fleet.
Loop 32.
Well, you must have done something wrong.
The doctor insisted.
Look, maybe we should have targeted the platoon of Daleks who landed on Copernicus Station. I'm sure they've got the weapon with them.
That one was a particularly bad idea. It meant that the doctor saw the slaughter of innocents at Copernicus Station. The master had enough time to watch the doctor utterly shatter with fury and grief and horror before things began again. Loop 63.
Well, you must have done something wrong.
The doctor insisted.
Look, maybe we should try my TARDIS.
Don't you ever give up.
The master objected, but of course not. That harebrained hope was half the reason he'd sought out the doctor at all. Loop 499.
Well, you must have done something wrong.
The doctor insisted. The master waited, but
That's it?
if even the doctor was out of ideas and hope, well, the master thought about writing numbers on the back of a recipe and shuddered.
Have you tried listening to them?
The doctor proposed after a beat.
Listening to Daleks. You really have let these humans rot your brain.
I don't mean negotiating with them. I mean eavesdropping on that big communication ship of theirs.
The master stifled a sigh. Dalek chatter was always the same. Exterminate. I obey. You are not a Dalek. That sort of thing. If it had any tactical advantage, the War Council would spend more time listening to it. Still, he had to concede that they hadn't tried it yet. So he and the doctor rigged a sonic screwdriver to Sir TARDIS console, caught the signal off the communication ship, and tuned in.
Quadrant Delta 3, clear. Quadrant Delta 4, clear. Quadrant Delta 5, clear.
They're scanning. They're not just here to kill people. They're looking for something.
For threats.
The master filled in instinctively.
Maybe it's not an experimental weapon that breaks time.
They looked at each other, struck with the same realization. Filled with the tumultuous adrenaline of the pieces of this puzzle suddenly, finally making sense.
It's a kill switch.
They said in unison.
They know it'll destroy time, but when they're scanning, they find a threat. They find a threat that's so terrible that they decide to end time rather than fight it.
The doctor said, words tumbling over themselves. There was a growing clatter of horror in the back of the master's mind. A second realization set to drown out the first. There was one thing in all these time loops that he hadn't tried.
What could the threat be? I mean, surely you would have noticed it too by now. And with how many times you've done this. It's the best thing about you. You're clever, you're a survivor, and you always find a way through, and you always find a way back.
He'd always found a way back to the doctor.
It's us.
The master said.
The threat they find is us together.
On cue, the Dalek signal changed.
Alert! Alert! Code black detected in quadrant Epsilon 8. Code black.
But if you break the loop by never meeting me, I won't remember you having been here at all. Or your new face, or any of this.
Crack. Time had stopped existing, so the master didn't reply. He didn't say, I'd rather you not remember. He didn't say, I've watched you kill, in fury and grief. You'd do it again. He didn't say, I've already seen how this war will break you, 100 different ways. He didn't say, I want to remember you smiling. He didn't say anything at all. Loop 500. This loop, the master simply waited. He sat inside his TARDIS for 6 minutes and 7 seconds. He listened as the Daleks arrived, but since they did not see him there standing with the doctor, no order was given to rip apart time, rather than confront them together. Instead, they simply laid ruin to Copernicus Station without a single experimental weapon or kill switch ever being triggered. The time loop was broken. The Master swore to himself that it would never happen again. If that complete destruction of time was the consequence that the Daleks had dreamed up for their friendship during wartime, then let the universe be spared from it. The two of them would fight this war separately. His current face would remain forever unknown to the Doctor. Never the twain shall meet. The Master of the last great time war took off from the massacre of Copernicus Station alone. The end.